these articles that individuals click on. Some of those have to do with Isaiah 53, which is the context of two of your books, or Messianic prophecy. But some of the others were kind of the perspective that, if anything, Christians have historically not supported the nation of Israel, and whether it's the Jewish people and the anti-Semitism, say, of Martin Luther, or whether it's the idea of maybe replacement theology, it seems to me that we have a lot to do to really help Jewish believers recognize that they don't have to turn away from the gospel message. And I know that's something that's really deep in your heart as well.
Well, absolutely. When the church is more supportive of Israel and the Jewish people, then two things happen. One, Jewish people see that, and they're encouraged to look more deeply into the motivation Christians have for loving the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And of course, that leads them back to a Christian's love for the Bible, for the Old and New Testament, for the Jewish Messiah. And then that really counteracts a lot of the historic anti-Semitism that's been out there. And also, I find it also motivates Christians, because if Israel is viewed as some kind of Middle East monster that is aggressive rather than defensive, that is persecuting rather than helping, which historically has really been the case, then people don't want to support people or pray for people that they don't like, or that they think they instead of praying for Israel's salvation, they're really praying for other things, for Israel to stop aggressing Palestinians and to get politically straight and so on. So it really clouds the issue. Historically, for a long time, because of the replacement theology and supersessionism of the early church, extending all the way to Luther and Calvin and many of the reformers, there was a negative view of Israel on the part of Christianity, and so on. You ever see, outside the cathedral in Strasbourg is one of the best illustrations, where you actually have that incredible statue of the woman who represents the church holding a scale, and the woman who represents Israel standing there with a blindfold on her eyes, and it's really something. And that's the view of historic Christianity, that the church comes out and the balance is right and Israel's blind. They forget about what Paul wrote about in Romans 11 and the future for Israel. And all of these factors together have hurt Jewish evangelism. But then, of course, with the rise of a more vital premillennialism and a literal view of the Old Testament, with the rise of Zionism, with many Christians viewing 1948 in one way or another as the fulfillment of prophecy, with sympathies that were engendered because of the Holocaust, you had an evangelical church that really swung the other way and became very supportive of Israel. And this really produced a lot of fruit. In fact, I was saved in the early 1970s as part of the Jesus movement, and there were thousands of Jewish young people saved. And I think one of the reasons was because Christians were more open-hearted to Israel and the Jewish people, and saw Israel as a sign of the times. And so the book and the conference and a lot of what we're doing right now is to try and get the church to just rebalance and recalibrate itself regarding Israel, and not just have this pendulum swing the other way so that Israel is no longer supported by good Christians.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to look at the Hebrew Scriptures. We're going to look at the New Testament, look at kind of the area of church history and practical theology. But another element, which I'll put on the table just before we take a break, we came from Dale Hansen-Burke. She found that some of the younger evangelicals tended to perceive Israel much differently, and you mentioned that just in passing, because those of us that are older remember when Israel was attacked. They've grown up in a time where Israel has been much more dominant, and if anything, sometimes they perceive Israel as attacking Hamas or groups like that. So there are all sorts of misperceptions. So we're going to come back and spend some time talking about what does the Old Testament say, what does the New Testament say, and how do we really begin to have a biblical perspective on Israel. And we'll do that as we continue our conversation today with Dr. Mitch Glaser and the book, The People, the Land, and the Future of Israel. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Domestic violence may be in the news these days, but it doesn't mean that pastors and churches are talking about it. A recent Lifeway research study found that pastors rarely talk about the issue, but are at least interested in getting more training on the issue. The survey asked how many pastors speak about domestic violence. The good news is some of them do talk about it on a fairly regular basis. Unfortunately, most do not. 1 in 10 never talk about it, 1/3 rarely talk about it, and another 22% maybe talk about it once a year. And if you add these together, 2/3 talk about it once a year or less. Is domestic abuse a problem inside the church? If this survey is any indication, there are many inside the church that are victims of abuse. Unfortunately, that is not how many pastors perceive the issue. According to the Lifeway survey, 72% of pastors who speak about the issue said domestic violence is a problem in the community, but only 25% said it's a problem in the church. A recent article in the Dallas Morning News illustrated the problem. One pastor in an African-American church told the story of a woman who confided that her husband was abusing her. He didn't think the man was capable of that, but when he confronted the abuser, he didn't deny that it had happened. An abuser can seem like a great person. He may be a deacon or an usher. He or she may be in the choir. So when someone has been abused comes forward, it may be hard for a pastor to believe that domestic violence takes place. Most of the pastors surveyed were willing to receive more training. Only 40% agreed with the statement that seminary provided them with sufficient resources to address the problem of domestic violence. And it's worth noting that 15% did not even attend seminary and therefore had no seminary training for this issue. This latest survey reminds us that we have work to do in the church. We need to talk about domestic violence and train those in ministry to recognize abuse and deal with it effectively. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the nation of Israel, its history, as well as a theological perspective, this is a great book. It includes commentaries by so many different individuals who participated in a conference. The People, the Land, and the Future of Israel, Israel and the Jewish People in the Plan of God. It is published by Kriegel Books. As I said, you can look for it in your local bookstore, but we've made it possible for you to order it as well. And Dr. Mitch Glaser, you're with us, and I'd like to maybe have you spend just a few minutes talking about the Old Testament. In particular, let's look at the covenants. We have the covenant of Noah, certainly the most important, the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12, as well as Mosaic covenant. How do those covenants in the Old Testament, as well as some of the other writings in the Old Testament, give us a proper biblical view about the nation of Israel?
Well, maybe the first one to really jump on is the foundational covenant in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. There God called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees, and then in verse 3 said, I'll bless those who bless thee, curse those who curse thee, and through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I not only view it as a covenant, I also view it as a prophecy, because it really outlines human history.
Yes.
At the end of the day, Kerby, we have two sides, those who bless Israel and those who don't. And ultimately, if you bless Israel, then you get blessed. If you don't bless Israel, you don't get blessed. And if Jesus is the quintessential Jewish person and the ultimate Israel, and if you don't bless him and bend your knee, which is what the Hebrew word barach means, to bend the knee, if you don't bend your knee, as in Philippians 2, we know one day every knee will bow, but before that, a lot of people are going to miss the boat because they're going to be judged, and they're going to treat the people of the Messiah poorly, and they're going to be judged for that, and they're going to be judged for not treating the Messiah with the veneration and respect that he's due. And so I think that's a foundational covenant. God is using the Jewish people to bring blessing to the world. He's done that already through the Scriptures. He's done that through the coming of the Messiah. But the election and God's covenants with Israel were not buried at the cross. They continue on through. And Paul looks towards a day when all Israel will be saved, and that will bring ultimate blessing to the world. And so we actually, in the book, we actually do a biblical theology of Israel and the Jewish people. So we start with the 5 books of Moses we call the Torah.
Right.
And then we go to the prophets and the writings, and then we go all the way through, so that people have a good understanding of the biblical sweep of the covenants and how God has fulfilled these covenants in Israel, the Jewish people, and the Jewish Messiah.
I might even mention that the participants in that section, Eugene Merrill, Walt Kaiser, of course, Walt Kaiser's been on the program with us, Robert Chisholm, Michael Brown, to mention just a few, that are really helping to develop that. And before we move on to some other sections, the question I would think, Dr. Glaser, some people have is, well, is Genesis 12 a land deed? Is that irrevocable? Is it revocable? As you are sort of alluded to already, because we're in the New Testament, does any of that still apply because it was given in the Old Testament? Can you sort some of that out for us?
Sure. The best place to look is in Genesis 15, when God put Abram to sleep in a vision, and then a torch and a broken pot sort of made their way through the cut up animals, and then, of course, the Abrahamic covenant is reiterated, is spoken once again. And not only is it spoken, the actual land boundaries are given at the end of this instance in Genesis chapter 15. And what that says to us is that the giving of the land to the Jewish people is not based upon Abram's or anyone else's obedience. The deed of the land, the gift of the land, the boundaries of the land depends solely on God performing or fulfilling his end of the bargain or the covenant. Now, one caveat. There is a covenant with the Jewish people that basically says if you obey me, you'll stay in the land and be blessed, and if you disobey me, you'll be scattered. That you see in Deuteronomy 28, as early as Deuteronomy 4, really,
right,
and Leviticus chapter 26. And so here's the way I view it. Israel always has a right to the land because that land is a gift, and it depends upon God's faithfulness, not man's obedience. However, in order for Israel to enjoy peace in the land, then Israel will need to follow the Lord, and following the Lord today means accepting Jesus and following him as Savior and Lord. And so I believe that day is coming. So in a sense, we see the prophecy fulfilled because Israel is back in the land in unbelief, as I believe Ezekiel in chapter 36 made clear. But the day is coming when Israel will turn to Jesus, and then Jesus will return, and the land will be at peace, the curse will be lifted, and the Gentiles will rejoice as well. So we have a lot to look forward to.
I would say so. Let's move to the New Testament, and Michael Wilkins and Darrell Bach and Michael Van Landingham, as well as Craig Evans, have written. And let's focus first on the Gospels, because I know when we get to the book of Romans, you want to spend some time on that. But when we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when we look at the book of Acts, so what do we find there in terms of Israel and the nation of Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, there's a big debate as to whether or not land is even mentioned in the New Testament, or whether or not that's part of the discussion. And I think our writers, Dr. Wilkins, Dr. Bach, and so on, argue pretty well that the fact that they were writing, the New Testament was written while the Jewish people were in the land, makes the land sort of a non-issue.
Right.
And so there was not a lot of discussion about the land because they were in the land. it's clear that Jesus is the fulfillment of the ancient covenants, and that the land belongs to the Jewish people. Eventually, things will happen that will try and oust the Jewish people from the land. So Darrell talks about the predicted in Luke 21, the predicted dispersion of the Jewish people after the Roman invasion in 70 AD, and so on. But even though there would be a number of dispersions, even those predicted in the New Testament, there would be a regathering. I think the most crucial chapter on that is in Matthew 24, and
Yes.
the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus goes into great detail about what's going to happen in the end of days. And of course, at the end of the days, we find Jesus establishing his throne in Jerusalem and the Jewish people living there in peace.
Well, let's go to the book of Romans, and certainly one of the first things we run into is where the Apostle Paul says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel." And I'm amazed how many times I'm in churches where they quote just that part of the verse, but he goes on to say, "For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." Explain this concept of "to the Jew first." Of course, you've written an entire book on that, so I'm asking you to do a lot in a little. But for listeners that maybe are not familiar with that concept of "to the Jew first," what does that exactly mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, Chosen People Ministries is a Jewish mission. We began in 1894. Our entire passion and goal in life is to bring the gospel to the Jewish people. And by the way, October 1st, we begin an online Isaiah 53 campaign in Dallas.
I do want to talk about that in just a minute, too. So we'll put that on hold until the second half of the interview. But what about this idea of the Jew first?
It could be best understood, Kerby, by comparing it with Matthew 6:33. In Matthew 6:33, Jesus says to seek first the kingdom of God. And it's not a sequential first. It's a priority first. And so it's not 1, 2, 3. It's not 1, then
Right.
2, then 3. It's 1 all the time along with everything else. So we seek the kingdom of God. We also seek a house, a wife, a ministry, a church, no matter what it is. In other words, you don't have to stop one to continue the other. And so I think that Paul was using the word protos as the Greek word for first, as a priority. So wherever you go, whatever you do in fulfilling the Great Commission, always keep the Jewish people a priority in your heart, because the Jewish people still have a vital place to play in the plan of God.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Isaiah 53, because that is something else that you have written about, of course, this new online opportunity. But I also want to give some of you, as you've been listening here, a chance. If you have a comment or question, perhaps you are witnessing to your Jewish friends, perhaps you have a place in your heart for the nation of Israel. We certainly are having a trip to Israel where some of you will be participating. We've had many guests on this program in the past talking about the importance of Israel. And as we've moved through even just half of this book, you can see that you have a lot of, if you will, who's who kind of people that we've interviewed on this program, actually writing sections on so many different aspects. So we're going to come back and talk about this Isaiah 53 project, but also talk a little bit about how we interpret some of this, how we understand it in terms of prophecy. A good friend of mine, Dr. Barry Leventhal, wrote one on the Holocaust. What does that mean there? Some things from church history and some practical aspects. But if you'd like to join our conversation today, that number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212, and that'll give you an opportunity to talk with Dr. Mitch Glaser. He is the co-editor of the book, The People, the Land, and the Future of Israel. Darrell Bach also co-edited that as well, and both of them, of course, as well as many others, contributed to this volume. It is published by Kriegel Books. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we certainly have it there. And we also have a link to Chosen People. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about that ministry, about some of their video outreaches and online outreaches. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take your calls right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800 888-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Mitch Glaser. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, talking about the book, The People, the Land, and the Future of Israel. We're going to get into some of the outreaches that chosen people are involved with, but let's start off with a phone call in this section, and we'll talk to Eva in Georgia. What is your question for us today?
Okay, now, this has been puzzling me. Now, I'm not trying to throw you all off, but I'm in Matthew 24.
34.
Mm-hmm. Right. Help me with this. It says, I tell you the truth. This generation will not pass from the scene until all these things have taken place. Okay, now, just picture Jesus back there telling, whoever he's telling that. And what he said, I tell you the truth. This, he was speaking of, that generation won't pass away until all these things take place. So was he referring to, as he said, that generation?
You've got some very good questions, and I think there are all sorts of people out there that would have that question. So, Dr. Glaser, let me come to you for just a minute.
Sure. That, of course, is a very difficult passage. A lot of people say that a biblical generation is 40 years, and so what some people would say is that the generation that would see the return of the Jewish people to Israel, because they interpret the fig tree blossoming as the restoration of Israel in 1948, they would say that Jesus then should have come 40 years later. Some people would say a biblical generation is 70 years, therefore we have some more time left. Then there's another group, like me, who take the Greek word generation, gene, which basically can also mean an ethnic group, a community. And so I think that what Jesus is really saying is that the Jewish people will not be destroyed until all of these things take place, because you have to see this prophecy in the context of the parable of the fig tree that begins in verse 32, and of course the passage you're talking about is in verse 34. So you can read it this way. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this community, this Jewish community, will not pass away until all these things take place. And so I have no problem taking it this latter way, and it clarifies it for me.
That brings us to another question, and I think it's, again, one more argument for the inspiration of Scripture, and that is you had the Jewish diaspora. That is, Jews were scattered all over the world, and yet we can still find our roots to Jews. I mean, try to find me a Hittite, an Assyrian, go down the list. We don't have that. And just the fact that even in the 21st century, we still know where Jewish people are. We still have a Jewish heritage. Although in your book you talk about the intermarrying, some of that is changing rather dramatically in Israel. But I think that is something that is pretty amazing, that even with all the persecution of Jewish people throughout the centuries, even with the complete scattering of the Jews, the fact is that you have a Jewish state, you have Jewish people, you have a Jewish lineage. I think that's pretty significant, don't you?
I think it's a miracle, Kerby, that after 2,000 years, God, of persecution, too, you have to remember that what Jewish people went through. Mm-hmm. The fact that God could keep the Jewish people together and bring the Jewish people back to the land of promise, reinvigorate and even recreate the Hebrew language. And, it's just an amazing miracle. And so certainly God is not willing for the Jewish people to be destroyed, and God has a lot left for the Jewish people to do.
Let's, if we can, just before take some more phone calls. By the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Mitch Glaser with us. You have written a book called The Gospel According to Isaiah 53. We've talked on this program how I think using Isaiah 53 can be a very effective way to reach your Jewish friends, neighbors, co-workers. But you also have an online program developing, and let's talk about that for just a minute in the context of all the wonderful things that you're doing there at Chosen People.
Yeah, just real quickly, Kerby. Isaiah 53 has probably led more Jewish people to Christ than any other passage of Scripture. And so we've decided to build a campaign focused on Isaiah 53. I wrote a book, Isaiah 53 Explained, about 175 pages, that basically explains Isaiah 53. More to a secular Jewish person, and we talk about prophecy, we talk about Isaiah, and it's a very readable book written to an intelligent Jewish person who just doesn't know a lot about Jesus. We've produced an online campaign, Isaiah53.com, and we have given away already probably 30,000 of these books. And right now we have the campaign going on in Israel. We've had 145,000 people watch a video testimony of an Israeli believer. And we've given away 150 books in Hebrew to Israelis, and that campaign is just getting going. And we've done it in New York, we've done it in Argentina, we've done it all over in Los Angeles, but we're bringing it to Texas beginning October 1st. So you'll see a lot of Facebook and Google ads and YouTube videos and all over the place. And we're going to try and use the Isaiah 53 campaign in Texas to reach the 100,000 Jewish people scattered around the state.
For our listeners in other states, is it going to be coming there as well?
You can bet we're going to do that. And so if you follow the bouncing ball of Jewish populations, we'll be in Florida, and we'll be in Los Angeles, and we'll be in Illinois and Boston and so on. And also a lot of this goes national, whether you want it to or not. It's just the advertising that you can specify regions at times. So yeah, we're doing that, and it's also been translated into 11 languages. And so Spanish, Russian, French, and the latest is Hebrew, of course. And the latest is actually in Farsi, because there's still a lot of Iranian Jews.
Wow.
And so we'll be using the book to do that as well. And so God is really blessing this because it lifts up Jesus. And when you lift up Jesus, he draws men and women to himself.
Again, I would recommend to some of you Isaiah 53 Explained. Of course, I also mentioned the book, The Gospel According to Isaiah 53, as well as the book, To the Jew First, The Case for Jewish Evangelism and Scripture, and of course, the one we're talking about today, The People, the Land, and the Future of Israel. We also have a video that you might want to put on your Facebook page. Watch it. It only takes about 2 minutes, and it was used to kind of introduce the conference last year, but also sort of introduces the book. We have some information about this as well, and of course the blog post that we've mentioned and we'll get into in just a minute, focusing on what unites Jews and evangelicals. And you said, Dr. Glaser, how useful Isaiah 53 is, and the book goes into it in a lot more detail, but it does seem to me that that is a great opportunity, if we know Jewish people, to send them to the website, give them a copy of your book, but even just to say, who do you think the prophet Isaiah is talking about there in Isaiah 53? And isn't it interesting that those prophecies, as well as dozens and dozens of other prophecies by not only Isaiah, but Ezekiel and various other, Zechariah, and certainly we have prophecies in the Psalms and the lineage and everything, all were literally fulfilled in one person, and that's the person of Jesus Christ, who we believe is the Messiah.
Yeah, Kerby, I know that a lot of Jewish people are somewhat secular. And even though I was raised in a more modern Orthodox home, still I was pretty secular as well.
Yes.
And so I needed to really believe that the Bible was true. And so they're seeing these prophecies fulfilled, the prophecies in Israel becoming a nation.
Yes.
The clarity of Isaiah 53 being fulfilled in Jesus. Some of these prophecies are just so amazing that they give a secular Jewish person more faith that even their own Bible, the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, is true. And that becomes a great basis for then considering messianic prophecy, like in Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, and Micah 5, 2, and so many other passages, Psalm 22. Once you believe that the Bible is true, then you're better able to put your trust in Jesus the Messiah. Jewish people need to believe that the Bible's true.
They certainly do. And there's nothing else like it in any religious literature. We have all these prophecies written down in the Old Testament. And, of course, they were translated into the Greek in the Septuagint. You can even go to some of these traveling exhibits and see some of the Dead Sea Scrolls to see they were written down. And so we know they were written down before. And then they are literally fulfilled in one person, Jesus Christ. And I think it's a very powerful argument for a secular mindset. And when we've had various apologists on, even just the other day when we had David Limbaugh on, he said that was one of the two things most significant to his conversion. So I think it's something to very effectively use as you talk with secular-minded people or even your secular Jewish friends. We're going to take a break and continue our conversation with Dr. Mitch Glaser right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Mitch Glaser with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Rhode Island, WARV. Helen, thank you for calling today.
Yes, it's nice to talk with you. I just would like to ask Dr. Glaser a question. I do have a Jewish friend. Her husband actually was a high school classmate of mine, and I just sent her a Rosh Hashanah card. And I'm thinking possibly she's more secular, as Dr. Glaser said he pretty much was, because I did put on it, God bless you, and give you a happy and healthy new year. But do most Jewish people actually celebrate, because I believe it began the end of last week, or are they more apt to start, say, the 1st of January as we do?
That's a good question. The answer is both. Jewish people, for the most part, do celebrate Rosh Hashanah, and which began this past Wednesday evening. And also, most Jewish people celebrate the Day of Atonement. And whether they believe in God or don't believe in God, they're very family-oriented celebrations. I mean, I gathered with my entire Jewish family, none of whom are believers in Jesus at this point, and we all had a dinner together.
Wow.
And so it's very, very important for the Jewish person to do that. And so we just celebrate 2 New Years. That's all.
Well, Helen, go ahead, Helen. Yeah.
I was just going to say where I purchased my card. I noticed there were also the cards for Yom Kippur,
Yes.
the Day of Atonement. So
Yes.
does that tie in around the same time then as the Jewish New Year?
Yeah, actually, you find out about all of the 7 great festivals of the Jewish people in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. And the first one, the Jewish year actually begins in the spring. It begins with Passover in usually March or April. And so really, we celebrate New Year's in the 7th month. And that's a very complicated part of Jewish culture and history. But we have 3 great festivals in this 7th month. Yom Teruah, the day of the blowing of the trumpet, which is Rosh Hashanah, the new year. 10 days later, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And then 7 days later, the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. And all 3 of these are very major festivals. And where I live in Brooklyn, we celebrate everything. But even most secular Jewish people will celebrate at least the first 2. And right now we're smack in the middle of what we call the 10 days of awe, the 10 days of repentance, where Jewish people believe the books of life and death were opened on Rosh Hashanah. They'll be closed on Yom Kippur. We have 10 days to make things right with God and our neighbor. And so this is a very important time to pray for Jewish people.
Well, I was going to say, these are just great evangelistic opportunities. Oftentimes, we're so busy celebrating Easter, we don't think of Passover. Oftentimes, at this time of year, we don't think about, say, Yom Kippur. And there are just some great opportunities for ministry. And as people go to your website, Chosen People, they can find some resources that would help them minister to and witness to their Jewish friends, won't they?
Absolutely. We have a whole lot of material on the fall festivals, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. You can even order an Isaiah 53 book for free for your Jewish friend.
Very good.
Our heart's desire is to get the gospel out. And so hopefully you'll find our website to be a resource.
Let's see if we can get another phone call or two in here. We'll go to West Virginia. Adam, you're on with Dr. Mitch Glaser.
Hi, Dr. Mitch. I want to thank you for taking my call, first-time listener, or all-time listener, first-time caller. I wanted to comment on the Matthew 24 question, this generation shall not pass. First off, I think you got to look at the items that Jesus was talking about at the beginning of the chapter before you can realize what generation he's talking about. I understood it as a child that Jesus was referring to verses 6, 7, 8 of that same chapter where he said that kingdom shall rise against kingdoms and nations against nations. And he talks about all these things that will come to pass. Is it possible that he was talking about this generation that's seeing all the trauma and dramatic things that's happening in the world today?
Yeah, that's a great point. I believe that what you see in Matthew 24 is a microwaving of historical events. And so you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars, and I believe that all of these issues that he talks about in Matthew 24 are going to be exacerbated. They're going to increase as we get closer and closer to the day. And so, yeah, I think that he's referring to all of these things. And, you know, sometimes we talked about young people not being as concerned about end-time events or about Israel and so on. And I really pray that our young people, and I've got a few myself, you know, I pray that our young people will have a more literal view of Scripture, because I believe that it will really change their lives. When we think of the future in very dark and gray colors, and there's not many specifics, we're not looking forward to the literal reign of Christ in Jerusalem and the regathering of the Jewish people and all of these spectacular signs. I think we really miss a lot.
I think so, too. And one of the things we try to do on this program is really working to reach the next generation. So we recognize that younger you are, the less likely you are to listen to a talk show. So that's why we're taking some of these ideas and putting them on YouTube videos and all of the rest, and really trying to educate this next generation, because certainly the older generation, the so-called baby boom generation, has been very influenced by prophecy and influenced by a number of events in Israel. But a younger generation sort of just takes for granted that Israel was there. They've never seen the movie Exodus. They've never really thought about the miraculous way in which the nation of Israel was founded. They don't think of Jews being persecuted because they see very prominent Jewish people, whether it's John Stewart or all sorts of other people, that are actually not persecuted, and if anything, seem to be not having to deal with some of the anti-Semitism that happened before. So I think it's really important for us to reach a new generation, and I think this book is a great resource, especially, if I might, just before we run out of time, for the pastors, because we haven't talked about the fact that you have a whole section here that you have written on, and also David Epstein and some others, on what the local pastor can do to preach on these issues. And just before we go, can you tell us real quickly what we might want to do there?
Yes, we wanted to really bring this down to a level that the average pastor and lay leader could really grapple with these truths and be able to apply them to not only their own lives, but to share them with their congregation. One of the neat things about the book, Kerby, is that it's cross-platform, talking about young people. We have QR codes and URLs.
Yes.
Every one of the chapters where you can watch the original message online, and you can even have David Epstein does a wonderful heart-to-heart with pastors in a little 5-minute conversation, and you can get to that video as well. So, I say amen to your creative efforts to get young people to think about these things.
Yes, again, they have those QR codes, so that's a way in which you can watch some of the videos. Of course, you can go to the website Chosen People and find some of those videos as well. And, of course, the book we've been talking about today, forward by Joel Rosenberg, and the editors Darrell Bach and Mitch Glaser. It's been great to have you on the program, and thank you so very much for convening that conference and then producing it in a book that I think will have a great impact. So I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much. And Kerby, during this time, we say Shana Tova, which means Happy New Year. God bless you.
God bless you as well. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get back into issues in the news. A lot has been taking place, and so we're going to be talking about that and giving you a chance to make your comments as well. And there will be quite a number of things that we will indeed attempt to address. So again, go to our website. You'll see some of the articles that will give you a little bit of advanced preview on what we'll be talking about. But don't forget again that this book is entitled The People, the Land, and the Future of Israel, Israel and the Jewish People and the Plan of God. It is a 350-page book, and it includes kind of a who's who in the Christian world that have all written on and articulated various perspectives related to Israel. And so if you are a pastor, a Bible fellowship leader, you certainly need that. But of course, all of us can read through this and learn a great deal more about the nation of Israel, and maybe answer some of the questions that so many people have. I tried to get at least a few of you on in this first hour to let you ask your question, but if you didn't get your question answered, I would encourage you to contact Dr. Mitch Glaser, and we have the link to his ministry on our website. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get back into the news cycle. There's a lot to talk about, and then, of course, we'll open up the phones again to give you a chance to join our conversation. During the break, you might want to visit our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join us today, 1-800-351-1212. This hour, we're going to spend some time going back and looking at some things in the news. President gave a very detailed interview last night on 60 Minutes. We're going to talk about that and some new revelations that are coming down and what might indeed happen with our troops and whether or not we will fight ISIS on the ground rather than just in the air. Also, we had this beheading that took place in Oklahoma. Governor Rick Perry has some things to say about that. We've learned a little bit more about those who have come across our border, so lots to talk about. But we do have a call left over from the last hour, and so let's go to that one first. Pam in South Carolina, thank you for calling us today here on Point of View.
Hi.
Hello.
You're welcome. It's my understanding that the Muslims and the Jews both consider Abraham to be a father of their religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, how did they become separated? At what point in time after Abraham did they separate into Muslims and Jews?
Well, that's a very good question, because I suspect a lot of people haven't had a chance to study this. Matter of fact, I'll tell you what, after I kind of answer your question, I'll put you on hold, and we'll let Catherine get your address. I'll send you a free copy of my book, A Biblical Point of View on Islam, and you can read it in more detail. But first of all, Abraham had, of course, Isaac and Ishmael. And so Isaac, of course, is the father, if you will, of the Jews. The Ishmaelites were separate, and Islam happened after the time of Christ. But I think it would be fair to say virtually all Ishmaelites are Muslim, but not all Muslims are Ishmaelites. In other words, there are more Muslims than that. But the split happens in the family, if you will, between Isaac and Ishmael. But you then have, of course, Christianity that develops, of course, out of the life of Jesus Christ. And then you have to go almost 7 centuries to the time of Muhammad, in which, at least in 610 A.D., he begins to express the idea that he is getting new revelation from Allah, and so begins to say that he is the final prophet. He says that Moses was a prophet, Jesus was a prophet, he is the final prophet, or known as the seal of the prophets. And so after he dies, then you have this spread of Islam in the 6th and 7th centuries and continue on to this day. And most of those individuals who accepted the idea of Islam were those who settled in that area. And so, as I said, a lot of the followers, I would say most of the followers and generations of Ishmaelites are Muslims. But of course, Islam is spread from not just the Middle East all the way to Asia. Matter of fact, there are more Muslims in Indonesia than any country in the world. But that's where the split is. So it is true that both Muslims and Christians, in a sense, as well as Jews, go all the way back to Abraham, but they go back in a very different way. For Christians, we believe the Bible teaches the true history, that Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac and then instead sacrificed a lamb. But if you read in the Quran and the writings of the Muslims, they say that no, Abraham was going to sacrifice Ishmael, actually in Mecca. This is one of the real contradictions between the Bible and the Quran. There are many others which I talk about in my book, but that's why you have that split. And yet, nevertheless, you have the 3 major religions of that world: Judaism, Christianity and Islam, all going back in one sense or another back to Abraham. Does that help?
It does. Thank you very much.
Let me put you on hold, and I'll send you a free copy of my book, and maybe you can read a little bit more about that. But again, it is an interesting history because many people refer to these three religions as the religions of the book. And by that, you are talking about the fact that all of them have some holy book. Of course, for the Jews, it is the Torah or the Old Testament. Many just hold the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Then, of course, Christians have the Bible, and then Muslims have the Quran and also the Hadith and things of that nature. So, interestingly enough, you can really represent a very large percentage of the world that go back to these so-called religions of the book. About 18 million Jews in the world. That's kind of interesting. You got about 6 million, almost 7 million Jews in Israel, about 6 million in the United States, about 6 million scattered around the world. Then you have about 2 billion people that could be called Christian, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. I don't mean that they're all born again, nothing like that. But, whether you're talking about Eastern Orthodox, whether you're talking about Catholic, Protestant, whatever, call themselves Christian in some sense of that word. And then you have about 1.6 billion Muslims. Again, not all of them are strict adherents of Islam, but they at least were born in a Muslim country. And there you have really 3 of the major religions of the world. If you want to be complete, you really only have to add 2 more, and those 2 come from what is called the Indus Valley, and that would be Hinduism, about 600 million, Buddhism, about 300 million, total about 1 billion that are of the Eastern faith. And you've done a pretty good job of representing the major religions of the world. Then you have all sorts of smaller religions, animism, and various cults and groups and things of that nature. But if that helps you understand world religions, it is a quick way to put that together. Well, let's move on real quickly because last night the president gave an interview to 60 Minutes, and the interview was done by Steve Kroft, who, by the way, Steve Kroft has really been criticized. I was watching even last night people posting some of his other interviews, and the implication is sort of becoming that if you're looking for a softball interview, go on 60 Minutes and have Steve Kroft ask a lot of easy questions. But nevertheless, last night we heard President Barack Obama say that U.S. intelligence officers failed to appreciate the gains made by ISIS in Syria during the last few years. It's our second article on our website, but I noticed what he said. He said, I think they underestimated what had been taking place in Syria. I think we have a pronoun problem. I mean, can you imagine after 9/11 and after we went into first Iraq and then we failed to find some of those weapons of mass destruction, can you imagine the president saying, well, the intelligence people, they just underestimated what actually was taking place there? No, I mean, you'd say we, because guess what? I'm the president of the United States. Here you have the president of the United States. He's been in that office for essentially 6 years, and he's still talking about they. There was a sense in which he was finger pointing once again, but nevertheless, we'll move on. He said, over the past couple of years during the chaos of the Syrian civil war, where essentially you have huge swaths of the country, they are completely ungoverned, and he went on to say, able to reconstitute themselves and take advantage of that chaos. He said this has become ground zero for jihadists around the world, and began to spend a little bit more time talking about the reason we underestimated, although he never used the word we, the reason they underestimated was because they had not taken seriously what was happening there. Now, this is the same president that was telling us recently that ISIS is not a big issue. It's just the junior varsity of some of these groups. And I think there's always been this kind of attempt to say that once we killed Osama bin Laden, we have Al-Qaeda on the run. We really don't have to worry about these radical groups. And I think of these social media videos have sort of shocked everybody into the fact that we still are fighting a war on terror, whether or not we recognize that they are fighting us. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to spend a little more time talking about some of these groups and what is happening over there in the Middle East. We'll be right back.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Domestic violence may be in the news these days, but it doesn't mean that pastors and churches are talking about it. A recent Lifeway research study found that pastors rarely talk about the issue, but are at least interested in getting more training on the issue. The survey asked how many pastors speak about domestic violence. The good news is some of them do talk about it on a fairly regular basis. Unfortunately, most do not. 1 in 10 never talk about it, 1/3 rarely talk about it, and another 22% maybe talk about it once a year. And if you add these together, 2/3 talk about it once a year or less. Is domestic abuse a problem inside the church? If this survey is any indication, there are many inside the church that are victims of abuse. Unfortunately, that is not how many pastors perceive the issue. According to the Lifeway survey, 72% of pastors who speak about the issue said domestic violence is a problem in the community, but only 25% said it's a problem in the church. A recent article in the Dallas Morning News illustrated the problem. One pastor in an African-American church told the story of a woman who confided that her husband was abusing her. He didn't think the man was capable of that, but when he confronted the abuser, he didn't deny that it had happened. An abuser can seem like a great person. He may be a deacon or an usher. He or she may be in the choir. So when someone who's been abused comes forward, it may be hard for a pastor to believe that domestic violence takes place. Most of the pastors surveyed were willing to receive more training. Only 40% agreed with the statement that seminary provided them with sufficient resources to address the problem of domestic violence. And it's worth noting that 15% did not even attend seminary and therefore had no seminary training for this issue. This latest survey reminds us that we have work to do in the church. We need to talk about domestic violence and train those in ministry to recognize abuse and deal with it effectively. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
So what have we done in the Middle East? What should we do in the Middle East? I'd love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk for another minute or two about what the president has said, and then I want to go to a piece by Andrew McCarthy because he says that the Khorasan group does not exist. This piece, when it came out over the weekend, I think sent shockwaves around, and a lot of people said, you know, we've been had, and that's exactly what Andrew McCarthy has said. We'll see if we can get him back on the program to explain it, but I'll read from his piece that came out over the weekend. But again, the president was on 60 Minutes talking with Steve Kroft, and he said that, again, the United States overestimated the ability and the will of the Iraqi army to fight this group called ISIS. And he said when we've got states that are failing or in the midst of civil war, these kinds of organizations thrive. So first of all, he was willing to point blame and place blame on the intelligence officials who failed to appreciate and underestimated the power of ISIS. Number two, his argument as well on 60 Minutes is we overestimated the ability of the Iraqi army to fight them. In the interview, which is the first one since the United States expanded its war against the Islamic State extremists, it says in our piece here, by conducting airstrikes in Syria with the help of 5 Arab nations, and this newly formed coalition is the biggest U.S. Arab military venture since 1991, which was the war to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. President Obama also went on to say that the United States overestimated, as I said, the ability of the Iraqi army to fight this group. He said, as we look at this, these are states in disarray, and again illustrates some of the challenge. And he admitted that it was a significant period in American history, not only with ISIS as a conflict, but also with the Russian incursions into Ukraine and the Ebola virus outbreak. So, interestingly enough, when interviewer Steve Croft pointed out that President Obama had spent most of his 6 years in office trying to get America out of military conflicts, President Obama then said he draws a distinction, which I thought was kind of, again, trying to make a distinction without a difference, a distinction between counterterrorism and occupying armies in Iraq and Afghanistan. He said that's very different from us having 150,000 troops in Iraq on the ground or 60,000 troops in Afghanistan. Then when asked if he was saying that America really isn't engaging in war, President Obama said the United States is assisting Iraq in a very real battle that's taking place on their soil with their troops, and insisted that the airstrikes the United States is conducting does not constitute war with ISIS. Well, I think Congress, if it was in session, would disagree and would want some kind of resolution to use force, but nevertheless, the president has moved forward and has actually now dropped bombs on more countries than any president in modern history. And this was, of course, the individual that ran sort of as the peace president, as the president to get us out of military engagements. And so if you would like to join the conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go first to Florida and talk to Roger. What are your thoughts?
Yes, hi there. I had a perspective on this. I believe that the wealthy Arab sheiks are really covertly the one that are funding ISIS and putting ISIS up to this for one reason only. They hold the power and the money in the Arabian Peninsula, and they want the common poor people to fight among each other for foolish ideological reasons, so that the people will not challenge the rich Arab Sikhs. And as long as we Americans go in there like fools and are fighting the war for the common man, for the poor Arabs, they will continue to rest on their butts, and we will lose our blood. And all we're doing is propping up the Arab sheiks. And then on top of it, the rich and the wealthy in America are pushing us to go to war, not because they believe in American idealism, but only because they want to continue to make money off of the military, the making of arms. So all in all that's going on in the world is the rich and powerful pulling the strings so that the poor and powerless can fight among each other, so that the rich and powerful can continue to preserve in their condition.
There's a kind of a philosophy that's used sometimes in the military: when your enemy fights your enemy, stay away. And, there was a time in which we saw the war between Iraq and Iran, and a lot of that happened when Ronald Reagan was president, and it was kind of like, I think we're just going to stay out of this one. We don't have a vested interest. Roger, the other question I think we still have to ask is, if we're going to arm those individuals in Syria who we at one time felt were not necessarily our friends and who might fight against ISIS, it's really kind of hard to choose up sides. So even if we wanted to get involved, I think there's some really big questions about all of this, and that's certainly one of those questions that I would think Congress should be addressing. And I think, first of all, Congress is on recess and will be until the end of the election. I think they come back, a week or two after the election. And then, of course, they'll take a break for Thanksgiving and Christmas, so I'm not sure what's going to take place, but I think this is a debate that needs to take place, and I appreciate you reminding us that sometimes those Middle Eastern conflicts, and I think some of the sheiks are doing that in part to foment some kind of conflict, but I think they're also afraid that it might run out of control, and that could depose some of them in some of those countries like Saudi Arabia. But I appreciate your phone call. We'll come back and take another call in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. But I did, just before the break, want to at least get to this piece by Andrew McCarthy. The Khorasan group does not exist. About a week or two ago, we, for the first time, heard the word Khorasan. And you go, what is that? I mean, it sounds a little bit like corazon, which is the Spanish word for heart. But no, this was a group that is seen as a group that's separate from Al-Qaeda. Well, Andrew McCarthy, who certainly knows a great deal about this and has written for quite some time on all these foreign policy issues, and is one of the individuals that actually prosecuted some of the terrorists, said we've been had again. He says, for 6 years, President Obama has endeavored to will the country into accepting two pillars of his alternative national security reality. First, he claims to have dealt decisively with the terrorist threat, rendering it as a desperate series of ragtag JVs. Second, he asserts that the threat is unrelated to Islam, which is innately peaceful, moderate, and opposed to the wanton, violent extremists who purport to act in its name. Andrew McCarthy goes on to say, now the president has been compelled to act against a jihad that has neither ended nor has been decimated. The jihad, in fact, has inevitably intensified under his counterfactual worldview, which holds that empowering Islamic supremacists is the path to security and stability. Yet even as war intensifies in Iraq and Syria, even as jihadists continue advancing, continue killing and capturing hapless opposition forces on the ground despite Obama's futile air raids, the president won't let go of the charade. Hence, Andrew McCarthy says, President Obama gives us the Khorasan group. The who, he says? There is reason that no one had heard of such a group until a nanosecond ago when the Khorasan group suddenly went from anonymity to the imminent threat that became the rationale for an emergency air war that was supposedly no time to ask Congress to authorize. Andrew McCarthy says you haven't heard of the Khorasan group because there isn't one. It's a name the administration came up with, calculating that Khorasan, that is the Iranian-Afghan border region, had sufficient connection to jihadist lore that no one would call the president on it. Andrew McCarthy says the Khorasan group is al-Qaeda. It is simply a faction within the global terror network Syrian franchise, Jabhat al-Nusra. Its leader, as actually believed to have been killed this week, interesting enough, in the airstrikes, was an intimate of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the emir of al-Qaeda, who dispatched him to the jihad in Syria. Except that if you listen to the administration officials long enough, you come away thinking that Zawahiri is not really al-Qaeda either. Instead, he's something the administration is at pains to call core al-Qaeda. Core al-Qaeda, you are to understand, is different from some of these other groups, which in turn is different from al-Qaeda in Iraq. He goes on and on and on, and after a while my head kind of explodes, because the point that Andrew McCarthy is making is the presentation that existed 2 years ago during the election. Remember that? Osama bin Laden is dead and General Motors is back, was the idea that we've killed the head of al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is on the run. Al-Qaeda has been decimated. Well, that doesn't work very well when all of a sudden Al-Qaeda is actually leading some very important jihadist actions, and one of those groups actually was planting imminent bombing of the United States through all sorts of nefarious plans. So you come up with the Khorasan group, and the Khorasan group, as Andrew McCarthy says, does not really exist. And I think his point is well taken. We have been had once again. If you'd like to read that piece, we'll post it soon. But Andrew McCarthy certainly created a stir this weekend. And if you would like to read the piece that we have posted here on President Obama admitting that the intelligence failure on ISIS is one of the things that he talked about on 60 Minutes, those are on our website, pointofview.net. In just a minute, I want to go to also some of the things that the current Speaker of the House, John Boehner, said, that we have no choice but to send ground troops against ISIS. I'm not sure you agree. Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We come back, we'll take some more phone calls and continue our discussion right after these important messages.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll have a chance to talk about what John Boehner said today or yesterday, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But let's take some phone calls. Melanie in California, KYCC, what would you like to share with us today?
I wondered if I could get some type of a comment on, every time I watch the news and then follow-up broadcasts about what Obama has said, everybody's surprised at how he either isn't telling the truth or I don't know. But anyway, my point is, when are we going to realize that he's a Sunni Muslim, and that's okay? If in the Quran, it's called decree. It's okay to lie as long as it furthers Islam. So, is there anything you can comment on that?
Okay, let me take it on. Let me take the broader one first before we get back to the president, and that is, you are correct. There are some places in the Quran and even in the Hadith, which are some of the sayings, but I'll stay on the Quran for just a minute. In Surah 16, for example, the idea that you can, in certain circumstances, tell a lie. Surah 66, that even if you have an oath, you are allowed in certain circumstances to break an oath. There are some Muslims who said that those are wrongful interpretations. Well, maybe they are, but the bottom line is that you do have a lot of Muslims that believe that deception is allowed in Islam. So that's a point that should be put on the table. I recognize that not all Muslims believe that, but the fact that you have radical Muslims, for example, that believe in jihad, even though you have moderate Muslims believe that we should not be in a violent jihad against Americans today, shows that there is a division within Islam. But let's at least acknowledge that there are those in Islam that do believe telling a lie is appropriate, and even if it is used to advance the cause of Islam, is commendable. Okay, so that's the first point. Now, again, I think we've always got to say the president claims that he is a Christian. He claims to have had a born-again experience. I'll leave that to the Lord. But when I have people say, you can't say that he has a Muslim background, you go, what do you mean you can't say he had a Muslim background? I mean, his middle name, the fact that he studied in a madrasas in Indonesia, that in his various books, both of those books in one way or another talks about Islam in a positive way. But at the same time, I'm not going to say that he's a closet Muslim, but I am going to say that you are correct in the fact that many Muslims believe that lying and deception are commendable acts, especially if they are used to advance the cause of Islam. I'll leave it at that and take him at his word on his religious affiliation. But whether you see him doing that as a Muslim or as someone else, I think it would be fair to go back and look at many of the claims that this president has made. Think of, for example, last week we talked about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Can you think of any statement the president made that has now turned out to be true? That if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. If you like your policy, you can keep your policy. If you like your hospital, you can keep your policy. Can you think of any of those statements or many others that have turned out? This is a president, much to the chagrin of many of his fellow liberals, who ran as the anti-war president, who was going to get us out of military engagements and has since then expanded them dramatically. And as one caller was going to say, well, he inherited that. Okay, I think it's fair to say he inherited Iraq and Afghanistan in part, but he actually initiated the surge. That's not something George W. Bush did. He went into Libya. That was not something that he inherited from George W. Bush. He is in Syria right now. That's not something he inherited. I mean, these are actions that were completely different than the platform he ran on in 2008. I've just given you Obamacare. I can give you some of the military actions. We can go on and on and on. And I think you can see that he certainly has not been honest with the American people. But let's move on, because I think some of you want to get into the question of whether or not we should deploy troops. And yesterday we had John Boehner, who was on some of the talking head shows, in particular this week, and he said, if the goal is to destroy ISIS, as the president says it is, I don't believe the strategy that he outlined will accomplish that. At the end of the day, I think it's going to take more than airstrikes to drive them out of there. Goes on to even talk about needing maybe to have boots on the ground. So that's where this debate would take place if Congress was in session. Let's go to Ben in Ohio and get your comments. Ben, what would you like to share with us today?
Well, the main thing that I really wanted to get was clarification. There seems to be, to me, on the show, kind of a dichotomy. At one moment, you have guests that are kind of berating the president for not being hard enough or not taking a more definite stand when it comes to getting ground troops, say, or pushing back harder at ISIS, or moving in stronger militarily. Then at the same time, today there seems to be kind of almost a snide saying the president has been a president who was supposed to be peace, and now he is moving more toward. And I think I think it would do better if we would point out the fact that the president alone is not making the decision. It's built on a democratic society where you have Congress, you have all the different parts of government that make the decisions, and the president is driven in part by the will of the people and the will of the people, the representatives that represent the people. But on your show, I'm just asking, what side are you taking? Is it he's not doing enough for war, or is he doing too much? Are you understanding my question?
Sure, and I think the confusion that is happening around this table is happening around America, and that is, if you're going to take America to war, I think it is the role of the commander-in-chief, whether that is Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War, whether that is certainly now George W. Bush going into Iraq and Afghanistan, or even before that, George Herbert Walker Bush. I mean, you really have to sort of make the case and rally the troops. Now, that being said, Ben, I have been around long enough to say, just because you make the case doesn't necessarily mean that I got to believe it, because when we were told that we had to go into Iraq because, indeed, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, anybody listening to the program back then will remember that whether it was Marlon Maddox or Penna Dexter or myself or anybody else, there were a lot of us that were really hesitant about whether or not we wanted to go back into Iraq after we'd already had a Desert Storm. And the thing that sort of, quote, convinced many of us around the table was Colin Powell giving that very famous presentation before the United Nations. And then it turns out that Colin Powell was wrong. And here we are again, having the president in front of the American people through 60 Minutes saying, the U.S. intelligence officials really failed to appreciate how strong ISIS was, and they may have overestimated how strong the Iraqi army would be in fighting them off. I think it's time for the president to, be the commander-in-chief and rally the American people around what needs to take place. And that confusion that you're getting from us around this table, and the confusion that you're getting from many of these talk shows, is because the one, I think, singular responsibility that the president as commander-in-chief should be doing, he's not doing. And so we've got all of this debate. But back to your other point, if we do have Congress... Yeah, go ahead.
Again, the question is, I completely agree with that portion. The question is, what stand are we taking, or I should say, is point of view taking in this debate? Is it for the president moving stronger militarily, or is it against the president moving forward militarily? Are ground troops necessary? Do we agree with that? Or will the fortified airstrikes be sufficient? So that's kind of, you know what I mean? It's like whatever decision they seem to make, the president and the Congress, whatever decision makes, seems like we don't agree with that.
Well, and again, I think what you do is you make the case, you bring your military experts, and we rally around that. And if we say this is what needs to take place, then we take that for granted. But right now we have, like I said, we've got this incredible division. We've played a number of clips over the last couple of weeks of some of the people in the military that I get the sense are convinced that this thing is not going to work. And if we're going to deploy troops, we're going to spend, what are we spending? About $10 million a day, and we aren't sure it's going to work, then I think you can pretty much guess where I'm coming down on. If you are going to spend lots of money, we're going to commit more and more troops, we're going to spill even more blood and treasure. I've got some real questions, but I'm willing to be convinced by people that have a lot more access to military intelligence than I do. But I also reserve the right to be a little skeptical, given the fact that so far some of this military intelligence hasn't turned out to be quite as accurate as we'd like. You raised some good questions. I think the confusion around the table illustrates only so well why it is time for the president and maybe even the Congress to get together, make a plan, stick with it, and explain why it's worth actually pursuing it. We'll take a break, take some more phone calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Take a few more phone calls, but let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have Dr. Ellen Wald on here talking about how in many cases when we teach about Islam in the schools, we are not teaching it accurately, and some of those questions I think are going to surface in our conversation. Second hour tomorrow, we're going to have Alan Dershowitz on just talking about the case for Israel to actually fight against Hamas, and so it will be a continuation of some of this conversation as well. Just before we take another phone call, let me just mention that one other piece that surfaced today has to do with Governor Rick Perry. He was on Fox News, Fox and Friends, in which he said that he believed the Obama administration also has to address what took place on Friday. We mentioned briefly on this program about this a woman in Oklahoma who was beheaded by Alton Nolan. He actually attacked two individuals, beheaded one, stabbed the other until he was subdued. And Rick Perry said at some point in time, the administration does have to address this as what it appears to many people that it is, and that it's an act of violence that is associated with terrorism. Right now, everybody's just simply saying it's workforce violence again. But this is a man that was certainly influenced by Islam. If you look at some of the pictures that have been posted, some of the actions that he has taken and showing his solidarity with the various Muslim groups, you've got to wonder. Rick Perry went on to say, I think Americans are confused about what this is. This is a clear case of an individual going in and doing something that does not meet the definition of workplace violence. So I think any rational thinking American is going to look at this and say, this is more than just normal workplace violence. So something else that we might want to put on the table as we're talking about Islam. But let's go back to the phone, see if we can get in a few phone calls before we wind down today. And Sean in California, you have the floor.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm totally against ground troops and being sent over anywhere in the Middle East at this time. And, I can't help but wonder what you think, this ISIS organization that came about so fast, and they've already got like another one, after this one to put out. And I'm just wondering are these organizations, how real are they, and did we create them a little bit? Because I'm watching different news sources outside of our news now for like the last year, and I just, I'm starting to wonder about a lot of the videos. I'll finish. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at this. I'm wondering about some of the videos. I did make a couple movies, and I've done some films, and I can't buy a lot of these videos I'm seeing, a lot of these staged, I believe they're staged events of certain beheadings anyway. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that are, because they don't look real to me. And I can see kind of a backdrop of a stage in some of them. The wind goes a certain way. People don't act like they would act right before they're about to be killed. I mean, the acting's poor. What's your thoughts?
I wondered about some of that. First of all, let's say what we can say is made up, and that's the piece I read just a few minutes ago from Andrew McCarthy. I always look for credible sources, and Andrew McCarthy, if you're not familiar, was the lawyer that actually prosecuted the first attack on the World Trade Center. So, I mean, the blind shake and all the rest. So here is an expert who really doesn't have anything to gain or lose by telling the truth, and so just tells the truth. And one of the things that he has written over the weekend is the Khorasan group does not exist. So that one is perhaps made up, and I think we fooled a lot of people for the last week. There is a lot of evidence that some of the videos that might actually be faked, because they had one video, you might remember, where they had all these supposedly corpses out there, and then they showed one part of the video where some of them were moving, so it was very obvious that they had actually had people lie on the floor and pretend to be dead, but they weren't, and some of that showed in some of the videos. So you have a little of that, but what I don't want to do is paint with a broad brush and say that all of it is. What I think we should say is it's that people that we generally go to and have respect for believe that indeed ISIS is an existing group, that it does indeed collect millions of dollars every single day from its oil sales, that it was a very formidable group that has been pushed back from maybe Mosul, but is still a dominant player and occupying about 35,000 square miles. So on the one hand, I think we should be skeptical, as I was even alluding to in my conversation with Ben just a minute ago. I don't necessarily trust everything that we're told, because I've found that sometimes individuals are trying to manipulate this. And don't forget, one other thing, Sean, we should point out, it's an election year right now. I mean, how much of what is being done is motivated by keeping Democrats in control of the Senate, and how much is motivated by going to war so that the president looks less like he's timid and more like he is actually dealing with this terrorist threat. Those are things that obviously we need to pay attention to. And if we discover other kinds of deceptions, I'm sure that we will do our best to try to cover them right here on Point of View.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for that great answer, by the way. I really like the station. I'm going to start listening to it when I go up and down here, back and forth on my runs. I'm working right now. But not being real well prepared, but I just can't understand why we're painting this country, and I don't mean us like the regular working class people, but I'm talking about the people who are running everything, or they appear to be running everything. They're making it out to look like, Russia and all these other places are bad, and we gotta do all this stuff to get them, and we gotta get there first. We gotta get this before they get this. I don't get it, because I see the other countries, like Russia, and I'm not trying to be anti-American, but I watch a lot of Putin lately, and I just can't believe that they could possibly think that, right now anyway, that Russia seems almost like it's more of a democratic, has points of view like America used to have, and it's more laid back, and we're the ones pushing troops in all these countries. And now Syria, to me, is really, this is why I don't even like to talk on radio and stuff like that, but I'm nervous, because for the first time I realized that, Russia's quiet, but they're building up, and they look like the good guys to a lot of Europe now. A lot of Europe is, thinking about moving in that direction, because Obama and our administration is always pushing forward like, you better do this or else. There's always that or else and stuff, and it's real pushy. And I just can't believe we're going to be looking at, because they're not going to listen to the American people. If they want to put troops in, they're going to put troops in.
Well, I'm hoping they will listen to American people, but one way that you can certainly let your voice be known is we do have an election, and whether you're in California or Ohio or Florida or South Carolina, where a lot of our listeners are, or our next caller in North Carolina, or wherever you might be in Georgia, we are talking about the very important series of questions you need to be asking right now. And I was at an event this weekend where we had a member of Congress, and a lot of people are asking questions about Obamacare. I understand that, but I'd like to also know where a member of Congress stands on some of these issues, because when Congress reconvenes, they're going to have to address some of these issues about whether or not we deploy troops, whether or not we're going to spend our money, and some of our foreign policy. Foreign policy, of course, is conducted by the president. He is the commander-in-chief. We have a State Department, but certainly we should have a voice in that as well. Let's go to North Carolina. Blackstone, do you have a real quick comment just before we wind down the program today?
Yeah, absolutely, Kerby. Thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to kind of make mention of is that, like, I served in Vietnam, I served in Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and I'm talking about where the shooting was at. Also, as a civilian, I served in Afghanistan twice, in Shindan, and also to another particular location as well, Delaware too.
Thank you for your service, but can you get your point real quickly, because we're just about out of time.
Yes, sir. Okay. Well, what it is, here's my concern. We're talking about consulting with advisors or the duty experts, and what happened was that we let about 5 bad actors go a while back to bring back a guy that basically was of questionable patriotism. And what that really kind of stabbed me in the heart, because these guys, we just recycle folks that were known to be dangerous. And then we have Mr. Hagee comes up and he says, I didn't know. That's something that comes from a PFC or private.
Yeah, I would think so. I wish I had one more time, because I hope you call back, because we'll get into that a little bit more. But here is a good example of bringing back somebody who a lot of people thought was a deserter, and then we send over some of those bad guys, and we've let some of them out of Guantanamo. Does this make any sense at all? It certainly doesn't make any sense to me. I wish we had more time today. We have run out of time, but we will come back tomorrow. Islam is going to be our topic through those 2 hours, and so I hope that you'll join us then. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.